Steel and aluminium have long been at the centre of Australia's industrial base. Manufacturing plants like this one in Melbourne's north have been turning raw metals into sturdy products which have built Australia for decades.
Aluminium is one of Australia's largest industries, and it's Australia's largest manufactured export.
But there is uncertainty on factory floors here in Australia.
And anything that happens, like the imposition of high tariffs into one of the biggest markets for our smelters, could have a flow-on effect which would damage the Australian economy.
This is the beginning of making America rich again.
That apprehension is about Donald Trump's plans to impose 25% tariffs on steel and aluminium imports into the US and its effect on the global economy.
Nothing's set in stone. This is the new era of the Trump administration, and they can change on a dime.
The US tariffs on steel and aluminium come into effect on March 12.
From the perspective of the US aluminium industry, it's clearly a significant benefit for them. However, from the perspective of American consumers, final consumers, but also final manufacturers, they will end up paying a higher price, and therefore it's negative for their margins.
The US used to be one of the biggest players in aluminium, not anymore. China is now the world's largest supplier, who has already been slapped with 10% tariffs on all goods imported into the States.
China's direct exports of primary aluminium to the United States are virtually nil. What China does have, though, is the export of more semi-fabricated aluminium products, which go to the United States. The nature of this bill as it's currently proposed will mean that they are also hit by additional tariffs.
All the countries, Japan, that flood us now with aluminum and or steel are being tariffed. They're being tariffed to defend the American people.
It was President Trump's senior advisor on trade and manufacturing, Peter Navarro, who singled out Australia and aluminium as a problem.
Australia is just killing our aluminum market, and the President Trump says, no, we're not doing that anymore.
I think it's ludicrous for some members of the Trump administration to suggest that Australia is destroying the aluminium market in the US when the supply of aluminium raw material in the US market will make up only 1 or 2% of the total consumption of US aluminium.
The White House claims Scott Morrison's coalition government reneged on a verbal agreement with President Trump to limit Australian aluminium exports. The president's formal tariff proclamation stated Australia has disregarded its verbal commitment to voluntarily restrain its aluminium exports to a reasonable level. Trade Minister Don Farrell declined to comment further. Last week he said it was a matter for the previous government. Former Prime Minister Scott Morrison and former Trade Minister Simon Birmingham also both declined an interview with 730 about the White House claims. In terms of the world's aluminium producers, Australia is the 7th largest. Its 4 smelters produce 1.4 million megatons a year. Most of it heads to Asia, the biggest markets being Japan and South Korea, and about 10% heads to the US, where Australian aluminium exports peaked in 2021 and 2022. In the last 12 months, Australia has been the 8th largest exporter of aluminium into the US, making up just 2.5% of the market.
The single biggest, and in fact the dominant exporter of aluminium to the United States is Canada. Last year, Canada exported roughly 70% of the aluminium that was imported into the United States.
Our primary aluminium we get from the local smelters, both at Tomago in Newcastle and the Boyne smelter in Queensland.
Downstream from Australia's smelters are manufacturers like Capral Aluminium.
If certain countries, particularly China, are shut out of the US market because of the 25% tariffs, then other countries in the world will be potentially open to receiving those goods.
Manufacturers who get most of their aluminium from Australian smelters are concerned about the impact these tariffs could have on global trade flows and the potential for China to dump cheaper aluminium in Australia.
Dumping of aluminium is when a country subsidises the manufacture of aluminium, which enables its manufacturers in that country to sell overseas at a price that's below the world price and below the cost to manufacture.
Capral Director Tony Dragicevic believes Australia's aluminium manufacturing industry could be one of them and is at risk without anti-dumping measures put in place.
Local aluminium extruders, of which we're one of 6, would find it really, really difficult to compete on price against the Asian suppliers, particularly China.
The impacts to global trade flows won't be known until after the March 12 tariff deadline. In President Trump's first administration, he slapped 25% tariffs on steel and 10% on aluminium.
We have deficits with almost everybody except us.
Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull managed to negotiate an exclusion for Australia on both of the key exports.
And that a lot of this is political negotiations to try to get certain things that they want. And I think if he gets those from those countries, then those countries would be more favored, or the possibility potentially to maybe get some relief in quotas or maybe exemptions or things like that.
The U.S. putting tariffs on aluminum is kind of strange. The U.S. is net short aluminum to the tune of about 50% of its needs.
Because of this, Wolf Research metals analyst Tim Natanas believes there could be concessions on aluminium tariffs.
I think there should be carve-outs for primary aluminum because the U.S. doesn't produce it, and it will be pretty inflationary and has already begun to be inflation for aluminum. And I think aluminum consumers could raise some noise about this.
Globally, this is likely to be very challenging for the economy, not least of which because it adds more friction and raises barriers, and that is likely to be negative for growth, not least of which because it raises the uncertainty, and uncertainty really deals a hammer blow when it comes to investment.
Those a world away from President Trump's Oval Office anticipate change will flow down production lines. How it shapes their industry is yet to be known.
It's a big contributor to jobs, over 20,000 jobs in Australia, and it's an industry that we think has a great future, providing we don't have unfair competition in this market.